Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to read a part of Sir Richard Burton's book, First Steps in East Africa, Exploration of Harar, where he discusses the superstitions of the Somali people. This is a part I found to be very interesting. Again, I have to issue this, let me call it a warning, that he was not an expert in some of these matters. So we need to bear that in mind. The only reason why this book becomes very interesting actually is because it's a very old book, and it's a book that was written by someone that during that time had traveled more than the average person. And then again, it's because this guy was trying to achieve something that was going to change the history of the Horn of Africa in a major way. And that is going to Harar to collect information that the British needed to, of course, take control of the port of Berbera. So we need to understand some of these things in that context. And I think I should insist a lot about that so that people don't get confused with some of these ideas that are in this book, that he was not an expert. We have to be to understand that, at least not in the matters like the superstitions of the Somali people or the culture and the way of life and things like that. He happened to be somebody who traveled a lot more than the average person, and then he happened to put down or to record some of these things close or almost to 200 years ago, which is very profound actually. So it gives us a perspective that we might not easily get. Maybe there were people expert then, or of course there were people who wrote expert documents, but those were few, very few, and so he happens to be among those very few people who, even though they were not experts in some of these things, they did get an opportunity to put down the record. So for that reason, we have to read this document, but we have to always remember this is not an expert. Maybe he was an expert when it came to spying and collecting information to be used for military purposes, but not as a linguist or some of those things that have to do with the social structure of people. Now, in this part, he tells us about the superstition of the Somali people that he encountered when he went into the land of the Somali people. And I'm going to read these parts, and I would like to hear from people in the comment section to confirm whether some of these are actually true and which ones are not true, and which ones still happen in the land and which one were abandoned and things like that, because 200 years is a very long time. Now, the first part, he says, the Somal, as usual among the heterogeneous mass amalgamated by Al-Islam, have a diversity of superstitions attesting their pagan origins. So he's making the argument that the Somali have some superstitions that come from before them becoming Muslims, which very many people will disagree with, and I know. Very many people will disagree with, and that's why I said we have to understand some of these things within the right context. So he's saying there are these superstitions that come before Islam that he identified, and he's going to tell us some of them. He says, such, for instance, are their oaths by stones, their reference of Khan and holy trees, and their ordeals of fire and water, the Bulago of Western Africa. So he says there are some of these things he identified, like making oaths using stones. Some people might confirm whether that actually happened. There's a way they took fire and water. And he mentioned Bolungo of West Africa, like some of these practices, maybe they had been noticed in the western side of Africa. I think that's what he's kind of like insinuating. And he continues to say, a man accused of murder or theft walks down a trench full of live charcoal and about spear's length, or he draws out of the flames a smith's in anvil heated to redness. Some prefer picking 4 or 5 cowries from a large pot full of boiling water. So these are, like he's trying to tell us that these are some of the practices that maybe were used to try to catch a thief. If somebody was accused of something, then they needed to prove themselves that they did not do it by maybe doing some of these things. And this exists in very many African communities. Not exactly this, but some practices that are done to try to catch a thief or somebody who is thought to have committed a serious crime. He continues to say, the member used is at once rolled up in the intestines of a sheep and not inspected for a whole day. It's one of the things that were done apparently about looking into the intestines or something of sort. They have traditionally seers called Tauli, like the Gri Grigri men of Western Africa. So they have these people who are called Tauli, who were like traditionally seers, people who will see things before they happen. And he compares them to the Grigri men of Western Africa, who by inspecting the fat and bones of slaughtered cattle, do medicine, predict rains, battles, and diseases of animals. So these people exist in different communities, and not just in Africa, actually. Almost all people around the world have had these people. This is something that often we think, oh, this is just African thing. Actually, when you read books like Herodotus' histories, or you read Livy's founding of the city, from the founding of the city, then you realize even the European tribes used to have these very similar things. For example, the slaughtering of goats and trying to look at the intestine. The Europeans used to do that as well. So it's a human thing. He continues to say, this class is both sexes. They never pray or bathe and are therefore considered always impure, thus being feared. They are greatly respected by the vulgar. Their predictions are delivered in a rude rhyme, often put for importance into delivered in rude rhyme into the mouth of some deceased seer. During the 3 months called Rajalo, the Quran is not read over graves, and no marriage ever takes place. The reason of this peculiarity is stated to be imitation of their ancestor Ishak, who happened not to contract a matrimonial alliance at such epoch. It is, however, a manifest remnant of the pagan auspicious and inauspicious months. Thus they sacrifice she-camels in the month Sabu and keep holy with feasts and bonfires the Dubshid or New Year's Day. At certain unlucky periods when the moon is ill-omented, asterism, those who die are placed in bundles of matting upon a tree, the idea being that if buried, a loss will result to the tribe. So there are all these things he describes that used to be practiced, at least by some, not all, by some of the people in the Somali community. Some of them are, of course, we can consider not very aligned with Islam. Some are vague in the way you can interpret them, but of course it depends on who is looking at it. Myself, I'm not a Muslim scholar, so I wouldn't really, don't take my word for it. I don't know what will pass and what will not pass. But anyways, so there are those superstitions that he brings up. And so he says that some of those came from the period before Islam. And he says, those superstitious, the Somali are not bigoted like the Arabs. This is the line I found to be very interesting because he uses the word bigoted and he considers the Arabs to be bigoted. But the British were very bigoted. He himself is, especially when you read this document, the way he describes, he talks about people, is very bigoted. But he doesn't see it in himself. He sees it in other people. He continues, with the exception of those who, wishing to become learned, visit Al-Yaman or Al-Hijaz and catch the complaint. So he says the Somali people were not bigoted. They not discriminate per se against other people or just look at other people and think, oh, okay, these people, maybe they believe something different and then they had a negative attitude towards them. He says they were not that. They were not like the Arabs who were that. And he says there were a few Somalis who will have that, but those ones are those who left their land and went and maybe studied in Al-Yaman or Yemen. It seems to insinuate that those ones will become bigoted, but those who were Somalis and they never acquired new ideas, they were not bigoted. They were not discriminatory in a way that tries to put other people down. Seems like that's what he says. And he says, nominal Mohammedans, al-Islam hangs so lightly upon them that apparently they care little for making it binding upon others. So while they believe in Islam, he is trying to argue that they did not check it to such extent that they kind of like forced it on other people. Seems like that's what he's saying. Maybe I'm misinterpreting his words, but that's the idea I'm getting from reading this part. So yeah, so that's the part where it tells us about the superstitions of the Somali people. Again, I have to repeat, we have to understand the contents in this text in the right context. We have to understand its historical context. who wrote it. Those are very important things to bear in mind when you consume a piece of content like this. So because sometimes we get lost, we forget to consider who wrote it and what were his interests and goals, and when was it written. And when we forget those two very important points, then we might get lost. But when we understand this was written by this person and these were his goals, and this is the era when this document was written, then we get to see it in the right context, and we don't get confused or perplexed. Those are my random thoughts.